On the afternoon of June 22nd, 168 BC, the plain near Pydna was covered by thousands of Macedonian phalangites standing shoulder to shoulder. At a command, their sarissas lowered together. Several ranks of iron points projected beyond the front line, creating a barrier deeper than a single row of spears. Small shields were fixed to the soldiers' left arms. Officers controlled the pace, and light infantry guarded the edges of the formation. While the phalanx remained aligned, the Romans faced what appeared to be a moving wall without an entrance. Rome's allied troops were first to meet it. According to Livy, the Paelignians attacked directly. One Roman officer reportedly threw the unit's standard into the Macedonian ranks, compelling his men to advance and recover the symbol. The gesture inspired courage, but courage could not shorten the Macedonian spears. The attackers could not reach the first phalangites. Several layers of sarissas confronted each Roman at once. Their shields could not simply push through the projecting points, and there was no space to use short swords effectively. Men attempting to force a path were wounded or driven backward before they could enter close combat. Livy suggests that if the entire Roman army had continued attacking an intact phalanx from the front, it would only have thrown itself against the spear points. Even Lucius Aemilius Paullus was disturbed by the sight. Plutarch describes the Roman commander as astonished and fearful when he saw the Macedonian line advance. This was not an obsolete formation waiting to be easily destroyed. Under the correct conditions, it could keep Roman infantry beyond sword range, generate pressure across a wide front, and drive heavy troops backward without allowing them to answer effectively. For several minutes, the military inheritance of Philip II and Alexander still seemed capable of deciding the battle. Then the ground began to change. As the phalanx advanced, the plain became less even. Small depressions, rises, stones, and broken sections of earth disrupted the rhythm of the march. Some units moved faster, while others slowed. The spear lines no longer remained perfectly level. Gaps began to open between separate blocks. Supporting troops lost contact with the phalangites they were meant to protect, and soldiers carrying long sarissas found it difficult to turn toward threats approaching from the sides. Paulus now saw something that a frontal attack could not create. The Macedonian formation was beginning to lose cohesion on its own. How could an army that had driven Rome backward within minutes collapse soon afterward? Pydna was not merely a contest between long spears and short swords. It was a confrontation between two military systems that responded very differently when an ordered battle became fragmented and chaotic. After Alexander the Great died, his empire broke apart among competing successors. Macedonia eventually came under the Antigonid dynasty. It no longer ruled the territories stretching deep into Asia, but it remained a significant kingdom with a strong army, fortified cities, valuable Balkan resources, and influence over many Greek communities. Its position between the Adriatic and Aegean also gave it continuing strategic importance. To Roman leaders, Macedonia was still capable of changing the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean. Rome and Macedonia had already fought 2 wars before the reign of Perseus. During the Second Macedonian War, Roman forces defeated King Philip V at Cynocephalae in 197 BC. After that defeat, Philip surrendered territory, accepted military restrictions, and withdrew from much of his former influence in Greece. Rome did not annex Macedonia, but Roman authority expanded across the Greek world. Greek states increasingly appealed to Rome in local disputes, while suspicion between Rome and the Antigonid monarchy remained. Perseus succeeded his father Philip in 179 BC. He worked to strengthen the kingdom by restoring finances, accumulating grain, training soldiers, improving diplomatic relations, and building marriage alliances. He also attracted support among communities that resented Roman influence. These actions did not prove that Perseus was preparing to invade Rome. However, they convinced many Roman politicians that Macedonia was again becoming an independent center of military and political power. The situation worsened when King Eumenes II of Pergamon traveled to Rome and presented a series of accusations against Perseus. He claimed that the Macedonian king was interfering in Greek affairs, expanding his influence, gathering weapons, strengthening his army, threatening Roman allies, and supporting political conspiracies in the region. Not every accusation can be verified independently, and Eumenes had his own reasons to weaken a rival. Even so, his speech gave the Roman Senate a political argument for war. The Third Macedonian War began in 171 BC. It did not immediately unfold as Rome expected. Perseus defeated Roman forces at Callinicus, protected important routes, used Macedonian terrain effectively, and kept his army intact through several campaigning seasons. Some Greek communities continued to view him with sympathy, while Roman commanders failed to force a decisive conclusion. Rome possessed greater manpower and access to more allies, but these advantages did not automatically produce victory. Poor coordination, inconsistent leadership, and difficulty operating against Perseus's defensive positions prolonged the conflict. The Senate eventually needed a commander capable of restoring discipline and changing the direction of the campaign. In 168 BC, Lucius Aemilius Paullus received command. He was an older and experienced officer with a reputation for seriousness and military authority. Paulus began by inspecting supplies, reorganizing units, strengthening discipline, and examining the geography separating the Roman army from Macedonia. He refused to waste troops in repeated frontal attacks against positions protected by rivers and mountains. Instead, he searched for alternative routes that could threaten the Macedonian rear and force Perseus to abandon favorable ground. This approach changed the campaign within weeks. For the first time since the conflict began, Roman preparations, leadership, and maneuver began operating as parts of one coherent strategy rather than separate ineffective efforts across Macedonia itself. Ancient traditions later emphasized how rapidly Paulus transformed the war. Appian records the belief that he arrived in Thessaly, took command, and defeated Perseus after a remarkably short campaign. The process was not effortless, but the strategic shift was real. Rome had not yet destroyed Macedonia. Perseus still possessed a powerful army and the Phalanx remained dangerous. Yet the arrival of Paulus brought the disciplined command Rome had lacked. The war was now moving toward Pydna. The Macedonian army at Pydna was not a single mass of Phalangites. Perseus commanded a mixed force that included sarissa infantry, elite guards, peltasts, javelin troops, archers, Thracians, mercenaries, Macedonian cavalry, allied horsemen, and soldiers assigned to camps, roads, and supplies. The Phalanx formed the center, but it depended on other troops to protect its flanks, screen its advance, scout the terrain, and stop enemies from entering gaps. The Phalangites carried the sarissa, an exceptionally long spear normally controlled with both hands. Reconstructions often place it around 5 to 6 meters in length, although the exact measurement remains debated. It was clearly far longer than the ordinary hoplite spear. When the formation was complete, several ranks of points projected beyond the front. Men in the leading files kept the enemy at a distance, while those behind added depth and pressure. Rear ranks could angle their weapons upward, possibly helping to disrupt missiles descending onto the formation. A smaller shield, suspended or fixed to the left arm, gave limited protection while leaving both hands available for the spear. The Phalangite was not designed primarily for individual sword fighting. His power came from alignment. Each soldier had to preserve the correct distance from the men beside and behind him. If the unit advanced in rhythm, the result was a dense front that was extremely difficult to approach. If that spacing broke, the sarissa became harder to control, and the entire system weakened rapidly. Under favorable conditions, the Phalanx possessed enormous strengths. Its reach was greater than that of almost any opposing infantry. Multiple ranks could participate in the same frontal struggle. The forest of spear points produced strong psychological pressure and could push heavy infantry backward before swords were ever used. It protected the front of the formation, fixed enemy troops in place, and allowed Macedonia to dominate a broad section of the battlefield. Pydna itself proved these advantages were still real. In the opening phase, the Macedonian phalanx advanced quickly and drove back the troops before it. The Romans could not simply rely on flexibility and walk through an intact line of sarissas. Yet the formation's greatest strength also created its greatest weakness. A phalangite needed both hands to control his main weapon. His shield was smaller than a Roman scutum. Turning rapidly toward the side was difficult, especially when surrounded by other long spears. On broken ground, individual files could lose alignment. Once enemies passed the points, the soldier had little room to recover his spear, draw a secondary weapon, or defend himself independently. This did not make the phalanx useless or permanently rigid. Under Philip II and Alexander, it had operated as part of a coordinated army. Light infantry protected difficult ground, guards supported vulnerable sectors, and cavalry attacked flanks or exploited disorder. The phalanx fixed the enemy while other arms completed the victory. Perseus also possessed an elite formation of about 3,000 men, often described in the sources as guards or the agema. These troops defended areas near the king, held important positions, supported the phalanx, and fought where greater discipline or mobility was required. At Pydna, they were remembered for continuing to resist after much of the army had begun to flee. Their destruction shows that training and cohesion could preserve combat effectiveness even after the wider plan had failed. The Macedonian army also included peltasts, missile troops, Thracians, Cretans, and other mercenary or allied soldiers. Such troops could fight ahead of the phalanx, protect rough ground, harass enemy formations, guard the flanks, and conduct ambushes. Thracian warriors might carry lighter shields, spears, and swords better suited to scattered close combat. Cretan troops were especially valued as archers. This diversity gave Perseus more options, but it also created command problems. Different contingents used different weapons, traditions, and methods of fighting. If communication failed or the battle line stretched too far, the army could stop functioning as one system. Cavalry remained another essential component. Macedonia still fielded royal horsemen, heavier Macedonian cavalry, Thracian riders, and allied units. In theory, they could defend the flanks of the phalanx, attack disordered Romans, close openings, and turn an initial advantage into a decisive victory. At Pydna, that potential was never fully realized. The phalanx advanced, but supporting troops lost contact. Gaps opened and were not closed. Cavalry failed to intervene decisively when the infantry still held the advantage. Once Roman units entered the spaces between separate blocks, the command structure could not restore a united front. Its strength depended on timing, terrain, and close cooperation between specialized formations. The Macedonian army still contained powerful parts. Its defeat came because those parts ceased to support one another. Pydna was not only the failure of the phalanx, it was the collapse of the military system that had once made the phalanx decisive. Before Pydna, King Perseus held strong defensive positions near Mount Olympus and the Elpius River. The terrain helped him block direct approaches, protect Macedonia, and force the Romans to operate through narrow routes controlled by mountains and water. A frontal assault could have cost Rome heavily, especially against prepared troops supported by natural obstacles. Lucius Aemilius Paullus understood that strength should not be attacked where it was strongest. Rather than repeatedly send legionaries against the river defenses, he searched for another route. A Roman detachment was sent through the mountains to threaten the Macedonian rear. If this force appeared behind Perseus, his defensive line could become a trap instead of a shield. When Perseus learned that Roman troops might reach his rear, he abandoned the Elpius position. The withdrawal was not simply panic. Remaining there risked encirclement and the loss of roads leading north. He moved toward the region near Pydna, where the ground offered space for the phalanx to deploy, water for the army, access to towns and stores, communication with the coast, and a route back toward Pella. The maneuver preserved the Macedonian army, but it also brought both forces closer to a decisive battle. The Romans and Macedonians established camps near a small river. Control of water became important, and soldiers from both sides guarded the crossing points. Paulus did not necessarily intend to attack immediately. His men had marched, units needed time to assemble, and the ground had to be examined before he committed the legions against the phalanx. Ancient tradition also places a lunar eclipse before the battle. Roman officers may have explained the event as a natural phenomenon, while some Macedonians reportedly interpreted it as an unfavorable sign for their king. The details are difficult to verify, but the story reflects the tension inside both camps as the armies prepared. The battle itself may have begun through a small and accidental confrontation. Livy tells of a mule that escaped toward the opposite bank. Soldiers struggled over the animal, one man was killed, and guards from both armies joined the fight. More troops rushed forward, officers sent support, and a local clash expanded until neither side could easily stop it. The story cannot be confirmed in every detail. Yet it is plausible that two armies camped so close together needed only one violent incident to trigger a general engagement. Perseus placed the Phalanx in the center of his line. Light infantry, peltasts, Thracian troops, and other supporting forces guarded the approaches and flanks, while cavalry deployed on the wings. The central mass of sarissa infantry formed the main striking power of the Macedonian army. Paulus arranged two Roman legions near the center, with Italian and Greek allied infantry extending the line. Cavalry occupied the wings, light troops moved in front, and elephants were positioned on the Roman right. The Roman army was more flexible, but it still required time to deploy its different elements. The Macedonians formed faster. Their phalanx lowered its sarissas and began advancing before every Roman unit had settled into a complete line. In the opening minutes, the Macedonian plan appeared to work. The massive spear points drove Roman and allied troops backward toward rougher ground. Yet every successful step pulled the phalanx farther from some of the forces protecting its sides. Paulus was watching the battlefield change. What began as one collision between two armies was becoming a series of smaller struggles across uneven ground. Perseus was winning the frontal contest, but the ordered battle on which the phalanx depended was already beginning to break apart before the Romans' eyes. The Macedonian phalanx advanced with its sarissas lowered, presenting a dense front of spear points. Behind them, officers attempted to keep every block aligned, while light troops guarded the flanks against sudden attacks from nearby Roman cavalry and allied infantry. Several ranks projected beyond the leading soldiers, while the files behind added weight and pressure. Commands passed through the units as the blocks moved forward. Roman troops threw pila and raised their shields, but the advance did not stop. The Macedonian center continued pressing ahead, forcing Roman and allied infantry backward toward rougher ground near the foothills. The first Roman attacks were costly. Livy describes the Paelignians attacking with exceptional determination. When a standard was thrown into the Macedonian ranks, soldiers rushed forward to recover it. Some tried to strike the sarissas with swords or push them aside with shields. Yet the intact phalanx offered no opening. The men in front faced several spearheads at once. Those behind could not pass through the crowded space, and the short Roman sword had little value before the distance was closed. The attack was driven back with heavy losses. The phalanx had not entered battle as an obsolete formation. While its ranks remained connected, Roman flexibility could not simply overcome it. The Macedonians continued their pursuit. Their success carried them toward ground broken by slopes, stones, and shallow depressions. Some units reached higher ground, while others crossed hollows or rough patches. Their speed began to differ. Many sections remained dangerous from the front. However, the long, continuous line started to bend and separate. Spearheads that had formed one level barrier no longer remained aligned. Small gaps opened between units, men lost contact with neighboring files, and supporting troops struggled to remain beside the advancing blocks. Aemilius Paullus recognized that continuing to attack the entire front would waste soldiers. Instead of maintaining one unbroken line and pushing directly against the sarissas, Roman units were ordered, encouraged, or allowed to move toward the openings, appearing across the Macedonian formation. The legion was organized into smaller bodies capable of operating independently. Officers closer to the fighting could redirect their men when they saw an opportunity. Groups of legionaries entered the spaces between phalanx blocks, attacked exposed sides, and prevented separated formations from supporting one another. The Macedonian army had begun as a great wall facing one direction. It was now being divided into numerous isolated struggles at different angles. Once Roman soldiers passed beyond the effective points of the sarissas, the advantage changed rapidly. The long weapons were difficult to pull back or turn within disorder. A phalangite needed both hands to control his spear, while the small shield on his left arm offered less protection than the Roman scutum. Men in the rear continued pressing forward even as soldiers ahead tried to turn toward attacks from the side. Sarissas crossed, collided, and blocked movement. Some phalangites attempted to abandon the long weapons and draw shorter swords, but close combat began before many could reorganize. Roman legionaries were better suited to fragmented fighting. Their large shields protected more of the body and could be used to push opponents. Their short swords worked effectively in confined spaces. Pila could also serve as thrusting weapons when necessary. Most importantly, Roman groups could continue fighting after the original battle line had lost its shape. The crisis deepened on the Macedonian left. On the Roman right, elephants and allied infantry attacked the troops protecting that wing. The Macedonian forces there failed to hold. As the flank withdrew, the outer phalanx units lost protection, and Roman soldiers gained routes toward their sides and rear. News and visible signs of the collapse spread along the formation. Units outside the central mass began turning, opening further gaps. The Second Roman Legion pressed into the center, while Allied troops widened the break on the flank. What had begun as a few irregular spaces became a general loss of cohesion. The behavior of Perseus and his cavalry remains disputed. Later, Roman and Greek sources accused the king of leaving while his infantry continued to fight. It is possible that Perseus was injured, believed the battle was already lost, could not find a usable route for cavalry intervention, or hoped to preserve mounted forces for further resistance. His exact motives cannot be recovered with certainty. The result, however, is clear. Much of the Macedonian cavalry left the field without making the decisive attack that might have protected the phalanx, closed the gaps, or threatened the Roman flanks. The infantry was left to face attacks from several directions. Not every Macedonian unit fled immediately. An elite guard of roughly 3,000 men reportedly continued fighting after surrounding formations had broken. They maintained resistance despite attacks against their flanks, the disappearance of cavalry support, and the narrowing of their retreat. Ancient accounts remember the unit as being almost entirely destroyed. Their stand demonstrates that training, discipline, and morale still mattered. Yet no isolated formation could restore the entire Macedonian line once the supporting system had failed. As the center collapsed, thousands of soldiers abandoned their sarissas and attempted to escape. Some ran toward Pydna, others toward the coast, and some tried to reach ships or swim away. Roman infantry, cavalry, allied troops, and elephants joined the pursuit. Livy gives a figure of about 20,000 Macedonian dead and thousands captured. Such ancient totals should not be treated as precise statistics, but they reflect the scale of the disaster. The decisive phase may have lasted only about an hour, although pursuit and killing continued until evening. Pydna did not end because Rome pushed the phalanx backward with a stronger wall of infantry. The Romans survived its frontal power, watched the terrain divide it, and entered the openings. Once the single battle became hundreds of smaller fights, the sarissa no longer protected the men carrying it. The phalanx was not defeated where it was strongest. It was separated, turned, and forced to fight where its greatest weapon became an obstacle. Pydna did not prove that the Macedonian phalanx had become useless. In the opening phase, it drove Roman and allied infantry backward, inflicted losses on troops attacking from the front, and created a barrier that the legions could not easily penetrate. Livy's account makes the point clearly. Had the Romans continued throwing themselves against an intact line of sarissas, they would have suffered heavily without breaking it. The crisis began only after the formation lost its cohesion. Rough ground separated the blocks, supporting troops lost contact, and gaps appeared between units that had been designed to fight side by side. The phalanx was powerful, while it remained a single system. Once divided, it struggled to turn, close openings, and protect exposed flanks. The Roman legion was not automatically superior in every situation. Its advantage appeared when the battlefield became fragmented. Smaller units could change direction, move toward opportunities, and continue fighting even after the original line had broken apart. Junior officers had greater freedom to respond locally. Large shields protected legionaries in close combat, while short swords worked well inside confined spaces where the sarissa became difficult to use. This was the kind of battle Rome could adapt to more quickly. Pydna was also a failure of combined arms. The phalanx of Philip II and Alexander had never been intended to win alone. Light infantry protected difficult ground, guards supported weak sectors, cavalry attacked flanks, and missile troops disrupted the enemy. At Pydna, those relationships failed. The phalanx advanced too far, the wings were defeated, gaps were not closed, and cavalry did not intervene decisively. For that reason, the battle should not be reduced to the simple claim that the legion defeated the phalanx. Rome defeated a Macedonian army whose separate parts stopped supporting one another. Ancient authors place much of the blame on Perseus. They accuse him of failing to exploit the early advantage, using cavalry poorly, abandoning the infantry, and losing confidence when the battle changed. Yet most surviving narratives come from writers shaped by Roman victory or hostile traditions. A balanced account should acknowledge that Perseus failed to coordinate the battle without turning the entire defeat into a story of personal cowardice. After Pydna, Perseus fled toward Pella and later sought refuge on Samothrace. He eventually surrendered to Rome. The Antigonid monarchy came to an end, and Macedonia was divided into 4 political districts under restrictions imposed by the victors. Rome did not immediately turn the kingdom into a province, but the independent power that had once dominated Greece was broken. Pydna therefore marked not the sudden death of the Phalanx, but the destruction of a kingdom that could no longer coordinate it effectively. The formation remained formidable. The military system surrounding it had failed at the decisive moment. The Macedonian Phalanx did not fail because its soldiers lacked courage or because the sarissa had suddenly lost value. While compact, it drove the Romans backward and remained almost impossible to attack directly. Disaster came when terrain opened gaps, supporting forces failed, and cavalry could not restore the line. Rome did not destroy the Phalanx by striking its strength head-on. It endured that strength, waited for the formation to break, and transformed one great battle into hundreds of smaller fights the Phalangites were not designed to win.